Thanks to Sal Digital for sponsoring this video. A comment that I see a lot when I'm reviewing small cameras like this is people stating that the sensor is just way too small and therefore means that the camera is not even worth considering. But is that even true? Well, to find out, I've got 4 different cameras with 4 different sensor sizes, and in this video we're going to be going through the pros and cons of each of them, as well as comparing the results side by side to see if there really is a noticeable difference, or whether it's more likely that these commenters are only buying larger cameras to compensate for their smaller appendages. Like me. But before we can dive into any of that, I do need to first state that I personally don't have any strong affiliation or preference when it comes to sensor size, and I actually use a whole bunch of different cameras for a range of different reasons. I also need to mention that this really isn't going to be a super scientific video because frankly I don't have the equipment to test all of this stuff in lab conditions, and even if I did, I would find that personally a little bit boring because I just want to focus on some of the practical elements of these different sensor sizes and how they will effectively impact you and your photography. But anyway, the cameras that I'm going to be testing in this video, going from largest to smallest, are the Sony a7 Mark III, which has a 24.2 megapixel full frame sensor, the Fujifilm X Pro 2 with its 24.3 megapixel APS-C size sensor, the Panasonic Lumix GX9, which includes a 20 megapixel 4/3 sensor, and finally we have the Nikon 1J5, which is the smallest of the bunch and includes a 20.8 megapixel 1-inch sensor. And why did I pick these cameras? Well, all of them were made within a few years of one another. They all output similar resolution images, give or take a few megapixels, and most importantly, it just so happens that these are just the cameras that I have lying around the office at the moment, so they'll do. But anyway, what about lenses? Well, I am going to be using strictly prime lenses that provide an equivalent focal length of 50mm on each of the cameras, which brings us nicely onto the first point of difference between these sensor sizes, and that's crop factor. Now, crop factor is basically a term that's used to describe the difference in field of view between different camera sensor sizes, and it's essentially a ratio of a camera's sensor compared to a full frame sensor, because in the world of cameras, full frame sensors are typically used as the industry standard when it comes to calculating crop factor. Now I know I've made that sound very complicated, but trust me, it really isn't. But there are a few things that you first need to know about how an image is captured, starting with something called the image circle. Now you've probably noticed that your lens is a circle, both on the front and on the back, and that essentially means that as the light enters your camera through the lens, it is ultimately projected onto the inside of your camera as a circle, aka the image circle. But the eagle-eyed ones amongst you may have noticed that the center itself is a rectangle. Yes, we are learning shapes today as well.
You like those squares, Bird?
That means that when the image is projected onto the sensor, it's only able to actually record the middle part of the image circle. Now, the smaller the sensor, the less of that image circle is able to be captured, and so it makes the image appear as if it's been cropped, which is also why APS-C cameras are often referred to as crop sensors. So what does any of this have to do with focal length? Well, because of this crop, if you take a photo using the same lens on a full frame camera and also on an APS-C size camera, the end results are going to look very different. As you can see, the APS-C image will appear as if it's been magnified when you view them both at the same size. Well, in truth, it hasn't actually been magnified, it's just that the smaller sensor has recorded less of the scene. And if you scale both of these images up so that the subject is the same size, you can see this a little more clearly. Now, the difference in size is referred to as the crop factor, and this number can be used to calculate what lenses you're going to need on your smaller sensor camera in order to match that of a full frame camera. So with that in mind, this X Pro 2 has an APS-C size sensor, and it also has a crop factor of 1.5 times. So in order to capture images with a similar field of view as our full frame camera, we're going to need to calculate 50 divided by 1.5, and that gives us an answer of 33.33333333 recurring. So that means we're going to need to find a lens that has a focal length of 33.333333 recurring millimeters, which obviously doesn't exist, but a 33mm lens does exist, and that would be the next closest thing. Now, sadly, I don't actually own a 33mm, but I do have this 35mm, which for the purposes of this highly unscientific test will be close enough. Next up, we have this Lumix GX9, which we've already mentioned has a 4/3 sensor, and this has a crop factor of 2 times, so 2 times 25 gets us 50, which is why I've got this 25mm lens for it. And then finally, we have this Nikon J5 with its tiny little 1-inch sensor. And this has a crop factor of 2.7 times, so we're going to be using this 18.5mm f1.8 prime lens to get us a 50mm equivalent in full frame terms. Now, needless to say, the crop factor of your camera can be a blessing and a curse at times, depending on the type of things you like to photograph, and it can make it tricky to know exactly which focal length you should be buying for your camera to get a specific look. For example, if you happen to shoot real estate, you're likely going to need to buy a super wide angle lens in order to capture all of those house interiors. Now, if you own a full frame camera, something like an 18mm will give you a super wide field of view. Whereas, as we've just seen, an 18.5mm lens on the Nikon J5 with its 2.7 times crop factor produces an equivalent full frame focal length of 50mm, which really isn't wide at all. So to get a full frame equivalent field of view of an 18mm on your 1-inch sensor, you are going to need to buy something like a 6.6mm lens. The point being, you just can't really rely on the number that's printed on the barrel of the lens. You do need to do a bit of maths in order to make sure that you're purchasing the right lens for the job. But this crop factor can actually have its benefits if your genre favors longer focal lengths, like in sports or wildlife photography. For example, equipping a 150 to 600mm zoom lens on a micro 4/3 camera, it will produce images with an equivalent full frame field of view as a 300 to 1200mm lens, which is an extreme amount of reach. Now, if you wanted to have this much reach on a full frame camera, then you'd be pretty much out of luck, because that kind of lens just doesn't exist. There are, of course, going to be some workarounds, like buying a teleconverter or just simply cropping your images in post, but let's not get too sidetracked. Now, another thing to mention is that with smaller sensor sizes, the lenses can also be scaled down to be made much smaller, and therefore they are generally much lighter, smaller, and sometimes cheaper, which is often handy if you prefer to travel light or you're just working to a tighter budget. But it's not just the field of view that is affected by this crop factor, it's also the depth of field. So most people are aware that in order to get a shallow depth of field, or that nice blurry background effect, which is the main reason why most people buy a mirrorless camera in the first place, you need to buy a lens that offers a wide maximum aperture, or small f number, like f1.8, which is true. However, how shallow that depth of field is and how thick the blur will appear is also affected by the crop factor that we've just spoken about. Now, as you can see from these two images, even though they were both shot at the same distance using a lens that has the same equivalent focal length of 50mm, the out of focus area in the image taken by the Nikon J5 is much less blurred than the one taken with the full frame camera at the same settings. So why is this relevant? Well, again, it's really important depending on the type of photography you want to capture. For photography where you want to achieve a nice super thick background blur that will give you nice subject separation, which is often the desired look for portrait photography, owning a full frame camera will allow you to achieve this much more easily. However, if you shoot landscapes or street photography where you need to capture a deeper depth of field, or to put it another way, to have more of the frame sharp and in focus, then actually owning a smaller sensor will make this much easier to achieve without having to close down the aperture too much. Just to give you another example, this image was shot on the Nikon J5 at f4. Now, in order to achieve the equivalent depth of field on a full frame camera, we'd need to reduce the aperture to f11. And obviously reducing the aperture to f11 is going to restrict a lot more light from entering the lens compared to f4 on the smaller camera, which means that I can keep my ISO nice and low on this smaller Nikon. But what about the size and weight of the camera itself? Because surely a larger sensor requires a larger and therefore heavier camera body, right? Well, not always. I mean, sure, the size of the camera relative to the size of the sensor is as you would expect in these particular examples that I have here, but that's not always the case. For example, cameras like the Sony A7C and Sigma FPL are smaller than some APS-C and even micro 4/3 bodies, but they still manage to house a full frame sensor. So it really does depend on the make and model of the camera that you pick rather than the sensor size. Now, as for weight, even in these examples where the size difference is much more noticeable, there's not a huge difference between them all. Well, except for the Nikon. In fact, most cameras that use a 1-inch sensor like the one found in this camera are the exception to the rule. Anyway, another advantage to quickly touch upon is price, because broadly speaking, the larger the sensor your camera has, the more money you should expect to pay. And that's not only for the camera itself, but usually for the lenses as well. Now, granted, the make and specs of the lens you are buying will also play a huge part in the price. But as a general rule of thumb, full frame lenses tend to fetch much higher prices than those designed for smaller sensor bodies. Now, before we dive into the actual performance of these sensors, there's one other subtle difference I need to mention, and that's to do with aspect ratio. Most imaging sensors have a native aspect ratio of 3:2, which creates the typical rectangular shaped images you would expect. However, this 4/3 sensor is the odd one out, as it has a native aspect ratio of of 4:3. 4/3? 4:3, get it?
Yes, science!
And that means the images it captures do look a little bit more square and don't quite provide the same amount of width. Now, you can of course change the aspect ratio to 3:2 inside the camera, but this will cause the camera to crop the image slightly and will result in a lower resolution image. So for the purpose of this test, we are going to roll with the native 4:3 aspect ratio, but hopefully that will at least explain why some of the photos in this next section may look a little bit different. Anyway, the first bone of contention is noise, because smaller sensors supposedly generate images with more digital noise than larger sensors. Now, without getting too technical, this is to do with the size of the individual pixels on the chip being smaller because of the chip's overall smaller size, which does tend to create more noise. So let's go ahead and test this out. Now, all of these images were taken with each of the camera's base ISOs, and to me, there really isn't a noticeable difference between the lot. Now, it's likely that there is going to be some subtle difference, but it's so subtle, I would argue that it's really not worth getting upset about at this stage. But as you can see, as I do start to incrementally raise the ISO, the smaller sensors appear to show greater amounts of noise much earlier on compared to the larger full frame and APS-C size sensors. Which makes sense really, because the larger chip has larger pixels and therefore is able to capture more light, resulting in less noise. So that is clearly a win for the larger sensors. So if you do tend to shoot low light photography or use long exposures quite a lot, then buying a full frame camera may offer some benefit. Or alternatively, we live in the age of AI now, and you can just quite easily use a variety of AI-driven noise reduction tools to remove the noise from your photos in post-production, which is done in just a few clicks. Okay, so what about out-and-out detail? Surely a larger sensor is going to be able to capture bags more detail than a chip that's just a fraction of its size, right? Well, here are 4 photos of the same scene taken at the same time using all 4 cameras, and the images you can see here are largely unprocessed RAWs. I did have to tweak the white balance ever so slightly just so that they all matched up a bit better, but honestly, that is all I've done to these images. So if we zoom in to see some of the detail here, can you actually guess which image was taken with which sensor? Feel free to pause the video at this point if you need more time to think about it, but without cheating, let me know your answers in the comment section below. Okay, so if your answer looked like this, then you'd be completely wrong, because this is actually the correct answer. Now, clearly there is one underachiever in the group here, which actually turned out to be the Micro Four Thirds camera. However, this seemed quite strange to me because I actually reviewed the Lumix GX9 on this channel very recently, and the results I captured with it then did not look anywhere near as mushy as these photos do now. But when I reviewed it, I used a totally different lens. So after seeing these results, I actually headed back out and retook the photos using the lens that I originally tested it with, which was the Lumix 20mm f1.7 lens, and the results looked a hell of a lot more crisp. So clearly this 25mm is either a bad copy or just a bad lens altogether. But either way, I think this actually nicely demonstrates that the quality of your lenses arguably play a much more significant role in the overall quality of your photos rather than the sensor size. But anyway, the final thing that I wanted to test before I was done was the whole notion that if you print out your work regularly, you should always buy a larger sensor camera because it will produce much better quality prints. So in order to test this out properly, the kind people at Sal Digital offered to help us out by providing me with a bunch of high quality prints in a variety of different shapes and sizes from across their extensive line of products. Sal Digital have also been kind enough to offer you guys a huge 50% discount on all of their products using the links in the video description below. Now, this offer is only available until September 20th, 2024, so make sure you don't miss out on that amazing deal. Okay, so at this point, I am going to be honest and admit that I am not one for printing out my own images, so all of this was a fairly new experience to me. But thankfully, placing my order using the Sal Digital app was a total breeze. And with so many different types of prints available, I really was completely spoiled for choice. But in the end, I decided to start off things by creating a nice 40 by 30 centimeter photo album, as I figured that the images in this would kind of be the same size that most people would want to produce at home, whether it's in their own album or as individual prints. Now, I've got to admit, I love the acrylic covers on these albums. It just makes everything look so crisp and high quality, and the colors just really pop. And I should mention that the cover image that I went for was a photo that that I took with the Nikon J5, which obviously has the smallest sensor of the bunch. So the fact that a 1-inch sensor can create a print this large and you really wouldn't question it is pretty much a good sign. Now for the interior pages, I opted for a silk photo paper, which gives this lovely matte finish, and honestly the quality is just awesome. I've also gone through and mixed up all of the photos so that even I've kind of forgotten now which ones are taken with which camera, and I wanted to do that deliberately to see if there was obviously going to be a noticeable difference between the photos and whether any of them stood out like a sore thumb. But honestly, flicking through this album, you really can't tell the difference. Now, obviously, all of these photos were edited using the same color grade, which happens to be one of my Lightroom presets, which you can buy at tomcalton.com. I think the only one that you can tell is the Micro Four Thirds camera, because obviously that dodgy lens does make it a little bit more smudgy than the rest of the images, but certainly between the other three, you really can't tell any noticeable difference at this scale. I also ordered some slightly larger 30 by 45 centimeter prints in these super modern metal frames, which I think turned out really nice. And from a distance, it's actually pretty tough to tell which of these images was taken with which camera. In fact, I completely forgot and had to double check and then make notes on the back of these frames so that I didn't forget. Now, I have to admit, it is at this scale where we do start to notice some slight differences, because this one was taken with the 1-inch sensor and this one was taken with the APS-C, and although they both, I think, look pretty damn good at this scale, you can notice when you look slightly closer that this one is a bit more smudgy than this one. This definitely looks way more crisp in comparison. And then just to go up another scale, this is the one taken with the full frame camera, and it does look noticeably sharp, like tack sharp, when compared to this one. But honestly, you have to be like a gnat's cock away from these photos to really notice the difference. So I'm going to say that most people really wouldn't be able to tell. But we can go one step further with this. So I ordered some of the largest prints that Sal Digital actually offer, and these were 60 by 80 centimeter aluminium backed wall prints, which also have a layer of matte acrylic on top. Oh, Jesus Christ. These things are huge. So this is going to be the ultimate test. Now, printing at this size is where I thought I would notice a huge difference, but honestly, the gap between them really wasn't as big as I suspected. Now, if I was being super picky, this was the photo taken with the 1-inch sensor, and at this scale, this is where you start to notice a little bit of noise here in the blue. And let's be honest, you aren't going to be printing something this large and viewing it like this, are you? You're going to be looking at it from a distance, and I think genuinely from a distance, you really can't tell. So, do small sensors suck? Well, yes and no, but as we've seen, that's the case for all of the sensor sizes. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. It's also important to say at this point that there are just way too many variables that we haven't even bothered to take into consideration here, such as the age of the sensor, who it was made by, the processing power of the individual camera, how the camera even processes the data it captures. It is a total minefield and way too complex to make unanimous verdicts based off this very small sample size of cameras. But in my opinion, I think it'd be pretty foolish to write off a camera based entirely on its sensor size. Instead, it is way more sensible to base your purchasing decisions on your own personal needs as a photographer.